here real quick. Okay, so we're live, we're recording, we got it all set. Hello, David Barash. Hello, David Smith. How are you both tonight?
I'm pretty good.
Yeah, doing fine. Looking forward to the evening.
Getting ready for a good conversation, right? Getting all settled in for a good conversation.
Well, with David Barash, it's always a good conversation. David is my rabbi, so
We'll have some good soul searching tonight, right?
There we go. Absolutely. We'll work on
I
it.
love it. David Barash, where are you calling in from?
I am in Redmond, Washington,
Okay.
east of Seattle.
Okay. And David Smith, where are you calling in from tonight?
I am at the other end of the country in southern New Hampshire.
Okay. And Warwick's is located in La Jolla, San Diego, California. So we have kind of the tips of the country sort of covered here tonight. So hopefully maybe there's some people in between that are joining us too. So for those that maybe are not familiar with who Warwick's is, that are joining us, that are either friends of either David here, as my little sign there says 1896, and we were talking about the pronunciation of Warwick's in our 125th anniversary this year. So while we're not the oldest bookstore in the country, we are the oldest continuously family-owned bookstore. So Nancy Warwick is a fourth-generation owner. And so we are open for business since the shutdown. We stayed closed for about 6 weeks, but we've been going strong ever since. So tonight I'm going to put David's books in the chat in the comment section of Facebook. You can easily click on that. Two ways you can get it. We could ship it to you. We ship all over the country. My standard saying is, any way there is to get a book, you can get it from Warwick's or your local independent bookstore. But then also, if you are in the San Diego area and you'd like to stop by and see us, go ahead and click that pick up in store. Lots of other great things to look at the store. David and David are going to chat for about 35-ish minutes tonight. If you have any questions, go ahead and pop those into the comment section of Facebook, and I'll bring those into the conversation at about that time point. So don't be shy. We love the audience questions are always great too. So I think I've given Facebook enough time to let everybody know that we're here and that we're live. So I will introduce you two gentlemen and we will start the conversation. David Livingstone Smith is professor of philosophy at the University of New England in Maine. He has published 9 books, including On Inhumanity and Less Than Human, which won the Anisfield, Wolf Book Award for contributions to the understanding of racism and appreciation of diversity. He's here today to talk to us about his latest book, Making Monsters, The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization. Joining him is David P. Barash. David is an evolutionary biologist and professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Washington. He has written more than 280 peer-reviewed articles and 40 books. David has penned op-eds in Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Chicago Tribune, as well as numerous pieces in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Nautilus, and how do you say this? Aeon?
Aeon, yeah.
Aeon. His most recent book is Threats, Intimidation, and Its Discontents. Gentlemen, have a great conversation. We'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as the interrogator, I'll start.
Okay.
It's great to see you, David.
Wonderful to see you too.
Almost as good as to read your books, which is saying a lot. So maybe better. I don't know. We'll see. I think. So David, you've become the Maven of Monsters, and I think it's really an admirable title. I want to congratulate you on that. But I wonder if you would be willing to start maybe by telling everyone a little bit about how you got here, how you achieved this admirable situation, and maybe specifically sort of the through line regarding your earlier books on dehumanization and how they moved toward the current one.
Sure. So I started working on dehumanization about 13 years ago. I was writing a book on human nature and war, and I came across all this dehumanizing wartime propaganda where enemies are described as game animals or predators or vermin. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. Let's look a little bit more into it. And I discovered that virtually all the literature was in social psychology. And I had a few issues with the way the social psychologists were approaching the topic. So I decided to write a book of my own, which at the time, and I think still is, the only single author, well, my books are the only single authored books on dehumanization in the English language. And that was the first. It was published in 2011 called Less Than Human. Now, when I was writing Less Than Human, I aimed to pull everything together I could about dehumanization from a diverse body of literatures and to theorize it. And I was kind of working it out as I went along. It was a voyage of discovery. So having published that, there was 10 years, right? And in those 10 years, I learned more. I had the opportunity to reflect on the work I had done in the 2011 book. And I had the opportunity to be responsive to criticisms. There were two criticisms that I thought were very, very important. And at this point, I'll describe only one of them. And this is my own criticism of my own work. If you actually look at historical examples of dehumanization, going way, way back and extending to the present, it's not simply that dehumanized people are thought of as subhuman animals, as vermin or bloodthirsty predators. They're very, very often, in fact, in the most toxic forms of dehumanization, typically thought of as monstrous beings, as demons. And so I needed a way to theoretically encompass that. And the new book, Making Monsters, describes how I do that, the changes that I've made to my account that make that understandable and really, I think, deepen the understanding of what dehumanization is and how it works, as well as adding all sorts of other, bells and whistles to the stuff I had written previously.
Sure. Well, in reading your book, your most recent book, Making Monsters, frankly, I don't mean to turn people off, but it helps in many cases to have a strong stomach, because some of the accounts of the horrors that have been done in the name of, or as a result of dehumanization really are stomach turning. It's also, of course, your book is very full of intellectuality, and there's a lot. It's not just the stomach. I mean, the head is very much engaged. As I was reading, I couldn't help but think of the famous final lines of Mr. Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, the horror. And so I guess I have one more personal question that I've been wanting to ask you, which is, how do you deal with it? It's one thing to read it, but for you to have written and described and recounted some of these awful things, not just the physical horrors, but the opinions, the views, the attitudes. You must have read an immense amount more than is in the book. So I'm just wondering, I guess, how do you armor yourself against the horror and the anger that must emerge as you're doing all that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's really important to be explicit and graphic about these things, because, there are two things. One is that our conception of history is, particularly our own history, whoever we happen to be, is usually cleaned up a lot. So I want to make it clear that, say, the atrocities committed against African Americans in the United States were unimaginably cruel and vicious. We need to confront that. And really, unless we confront that, we're not so motivated to take dehumanization seriously. and to do something about it. It becomes just some sort of concept. And I want to rub readers' noses in it, so to speak. Some people say, well, all that graphic stuff, it detracts from your arguments. I say, no, it's part of the argument.
Yeah,
It's
it's the
essential.
background of it, the essential background.
This is what we're talking about, and this is why we need to take dehumanization immensely seriously. Now, how do I manage? Well, when I'm asked that question, sometimes I think, is there something wrong with me? That I can do that. But I'm inclined to say, to give an analogy, how does an oncologist manage? I mean, they're there engaging with cancer all the time. Cancer is a horrible thing. They're confronted with tragedy all the time. Well, it's my job. It's my mission. I mean, it's in a sense, I've grown accustomed to it. I'm no longer surprised. I still am horrified, but that horror turns into a sense of urgency about addressing these topics in a way that's accessible to a very broad general public.
Well, and there's no question that what you did is accessible. It's both important and accessible, which is a combination that one does not encounter as often as ought to be the case. So I think you're very much to be congratulated and thanked for that, for all the horror that you had to absorb in the process of doing it. Actually, your comment about the importance of it makes me want, I'm just very briefly to read, you know this, obviously, this was the epigraph, you used this as the epigraph for your book from the German philosopher Karl Jaspers writing after the Holocaust. That which has happened is a warning. To forget it is guilt. It must be continually remembered. It was possible for this to happen, and it remains possible for it to happen again at any minute. Only in knowledge can it be prevented.
Yeah. And that was the other reason I alluded to when I was talking about giving very explicit descriptions of these atrocities. And my main two paradigmatic examples are the treatment of African Americans during Jim Crow and the treatment of Jews during the Third Reich and the prehistory of vicious, violent anti-Semitism,
Right.
going back to the 12th century. So look, if we want to address dehumanization, there are a lot of things that need to be in place, but one of them is we need to recognize that we are capable of doing it. It's not monsters, right? It's not, that's the tendency to think that Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler were monsters. No, they were people, and we're people. And we are certainly capable, under the right circumstances, of falling into the ways of thinking that many Germans and many white Americans fell into, convinced that they were in the right, convinced that they were ridding the world of evil, and so on. Now, to do that requires a certain amount of moral humility. That is, we have to knock ourselves off of our pedestal. And this is very difficult for Americans with our illusions of American exceptionalism. So learning history properly, learning these aspects of history properly, really forces one to realize, yeah, we did these things. And if we did them, that means we're capable of doing them. And if we're capable of doing them, we may do them again, or we may be doing them now without recognizing it.
Yeah, all too true. I'd like to maybe go into, among the fascinating areas that you do go into, there's the whole question of the uncanny, which you raise in the subtitle. And I wonder if you could, well, let me add a little something. Here we are, what is it, October 19th. So Halloween's coming up sometime. I have to say it was always my least favorite holiday because I hated figuring out costumes for the kids and all, but I find it interesting that inevitably, of course, Halloween costumes involve semi-humans, right?
Yeah.
People have to walk around on two legs, and but they're human, and yet they look pretty weird and maybe uncanny, depending on the accuracy of the costume. But I wonder if you could talk a bit, because I think that phenomenon of the uncanny is absolutely fascinating and a
Yeah.
really important part of your argument.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So to understanding how dehumanization makes monsters is impossible without understanding the uncanny. So the full story is kind of complicated, as you know, and the place to start is to note that, as I said before, in the most dangerous forms of dehumanization, the forms of dehumanization that eventuate in mass atrocity, in horrible torture, in genocide, those who are dehumanized are conceived of as monsters. Now, what exactly is a monster? A monster in the horrific sense. So the monster of, say, horror fiction. And what I'm intending to do here is, exclude creatures like Godzilla, which is just a very large reptile, right?
And in a way, there's nothing. I'm just going to add, in a way, there's nothing. Just think uncanny about Godzilla or King Kong.
Horrific. I mean,
whereas there is about the Frankenstein monster,
exactly,
or Dracula, because of their humanness, and yet they're not really human, or not quite human. Or
yeah. So if you look at the horrific monsters of fiction, of novels and movies and so on, the common theme is that they're kind of impossible beings. That is, they possess properties that could not exist together, that exclude one another. So my favorite example to get the point across is zombies and zombie movies, right? Well, zombies are simultaneously alive and dead. That's impossible. Now, it's that fact about them that makes them so spine-chilling, right? I mean, they're doddering around. Of course, yeah, they want to eat your brains, but they don't seem particularly physically formidable. Yeah. But the combination of alive and dead in one package is just very disturbing. And the term uncanny, I mean, I've sort of adopted it because this is the standard English translation of terms which in other languages, Bohemian Japanese and Unheimlich in German, have a more disturbing quality. Right. So how does this connect with monsters and dehumanization? Well, I argue in the book that there's a terrible paradox inherent in dehumanization. When people dehumanize others, they initially attribute to them the essence of a subhuman animal, right? A cockroach, a poisonous snake, a hyena, there are all sorts of cultural variants on this. But the problem is that those dehumanizers, or those who have more frequently been convinced by propagandists that these others are not really human beings on the inside, can't help conceiving of them as humans as well. I think this is an automatic, modular psychological response that stems from the fact that we're an ultra-social species. I mean, apart from the social insects, there's like no one as social as we are. And for that to be the case, we need to be really finely attuned to one another. There's a literature even about the unique facial musculature of human beings and the construction of our eyes, which is hypothesized to be pertinent to that. So when confronted with another human being, particularly, this is not limited to vision, but particularly the side of a human face, and particularly the side of a pair of eyes, human eyes, we just cannot help responding to the other as a fellow member of our species. So think of the situation then. You've been convinced, let's pretend listeners out there, I'm assuming there are listeners, I can't tell, that you're Nazis, you're SS officers, and here you are listening to two old Jews, and you've been convinced by the propaganda that we are Untermenschen, we're subhumans. And you take that on board because after all, the Nazi race experts should know, right? They're distinguished scientists and influential people. But at the same time, in looking at us and listening to us, you can't help seeing us as human.
Oh,
What that means is you have two contradictory images, two contradictory representations of what we are. And that has the unfortunate consequence of transmuting us, not merely into vermin, but into monsters. Just like the zombie that's alive and dead, we're human and subhuman at the same time, to you.
yeah. And actually, I have here, I copied down a sentence you wrote toward the end of the book that says that very succinctly and very well, which is, and I quote, the aim of dehumanization is to turn people into animals, but because it is next to impossible to completely shut off awareness of their humanity, it turns them into monsters instead.
Yeah.
That's fascinating ambivalence. And we have a heck of a time being in between. We know animals, we know people, but the notion of trying to get our arms around a combination of the two freaks people out.
Yeah. And there are really important reasons why it freaks people out as well, because when beings are seen as contradictory, like monsters and demons and zombies and so on, they're felt to be a violation of the order of nature. So in every culture, there are systems of categories that we use to organize things, like biological species or chemical elements or whatever. And these frameworks give us a sense of security. They help us navigate the world. But you see, a monster falls outside of that. As a contradictory being, the monster transgresses these categories. And that's really disturbing. It's like if something can be human and subhuman at the same time, anything could happen. Now, the consequence of that for on-the-ground humanization is really a tragedy, because it's very often, in fact, I would say typically, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized members of a population that are dehumanized. But when they're transmuted into monsters, they're seen as formidably dangerous. The dangerousness attributed to them initially, dehumanized people are first racialized, and they're typically thought of as criminals, as rapists, as murderers, and so on. So starting out, there's this propaganda about the group, be it Jews, be it African Americans, be it Rohingya in Myanmar, be it Uyghurs in China. They're seen as just dangerous criminal types, terrorists, and so on. When they're turned into monsters, this dangerousness is just massively inflated. And then the persecution which they must endure is correspondingly inflated, correspondingly cruel. I mean, what do you do with a monster? You destroy it. There's no cruelty that is unfitting for dealing with a monster.
It's hard to add to that. I mean, there's so much more we can say, but at some point I kind of need to pause and absorb what you just said. And you said so well in the book as well. I think I would like to add, though, or ask you to talk about the whole question of, okay, so we talked some, we couldn't possibly talk enough about this, but we've talked some about why monster, or how it is that monsters engage the uncanny, or because of that they become monstrous. What you do talk about as well in the book, and that must be arising in people's minds, is why? I mean, in some ways, it's an unforced error. It's not like we have to find monsters. We say
Yeah.
here there be dragons, I suppose, in the ocean, used to, but why? So you do a wonderful, again, talking about ideologies and why
Yeah.
the pressures for doing this in the first place.
Yeah. So in the first place, it's a somewhat intricate story. So I think dehumanization has a function, first of all. And that function is to disable inhibitions against violence. So if we can go back to humans as an ultra-social species, as you know, it's a truism in biology that social animals have inhibitions against severe forms of violence in their immediate communities. And that has to be the case, right? Or they couldn't maintain a social existence. Typically, strangers are fair game, but within the breeding group, violence is inhibited. Now, we Homo sapiens are being ultra-social, need to have particularly powerful inhibitions. And this is especially because our ultra-sociality has, for a very, very long time, extended beyond our immediate communities. We know that in the old Stone Age, there were trading relations between distant populations. So you might think, oh, cool. But why is history littered with corpses then? Well, I think there's another factor having to do with our evolution, which is relevant here. So we've got these great big brains, and we're able to think very well instrumentally and to recognize that doing violence to others may be to our benefit, the benefit of our community. And being clever primates, we've worked out all sorts of cultural means for disinhibiting lethal, even sublethal aggression, unleashing it against our neighbors. Now, there are various ways that it's been done. It's been done with drugs. It's been done with mind-altering rituals. It's been done with certain kinds of religious ideologies. And it's done with dehumanizing propaganda. So in convincing a group of people that these others, that it's in the interest typically of the leader to harm, we'll get to that in a second, we can not only overcome the reluctance to kill, but actually the act of dehumanization motivates violence. So, you know, the dehumanized others, they're never pretty butterflies or cute puppies, right? They're filthy, disease-carrying vermin or bloodthirsty, predatory apes, or, you know, you take your pick, but it's always bad. So notice I said dehumanizing propaganda. This is really, really important, and this is something I didn't understand properly when I wrote my first humanization book. If you look at the historical examples, dehumanization is not something that arises spontaneously from within. It's not like, you know, outgroup biases. That's probably just a feature of being a human being, that we tend to favor those with whom we identify over and above those with whom we don't. Dehumanization is something special, and it comes from others. It comes from those in whom we place a certain kind of epistemic authority. Let me be less fancy with the words. It comes from those who are supposed to know. So there's something that we philosophers call the cognitive division of labor. And this is really, really important for human culture. There are people who are experts, who are authorities, or I should say regarded as such, because it's not always merited. And then there are those of us who are not authorities, and we defer to the authorities. So my favorite example that desk in front of me, the physicists tell me it's mostly empty space. It doesn't look like it to me. My eyes tell me a different story, but I defer to the microphysicists. Why? They're supposed to know. They're in that position of authority. So there's a kind of trust involved in that, a kind of leap of faith that what they're telling me is true, even though it doesn't seem true. Now, where this gets extraordinarily dangerous is in the political sphere, when the authority, quote, end of quote, be they an authoritarian politician or a scientific racist or a religious leader, tells us, the consumers of their propaganda, that these others are not really human. They might look human, just like the table might look devoid of gaps, but they're not really human. And if these people are sufficiently impressive, if we've invested sufficient authority in them, then of course it's rational for us to take that on board. And in taking that on board, we set ourselves up not only for simply dehumanizing the others as subhuman creatures, but through the mechanisms that I just described, transforming them into monsters and being complicit or being complicit or actually enactors of at the Holocaust, right? And you know, the Nazis, to give an example, were really good at that. Now there are more layers to this, having to do with how ideologies get formed, how they become entrenched, and then how changes in the social ecology can trigger them, how skillful propaganda can act as a match to dry kindling and inflame ideas that have been relatively latent, sometimes for centuries. But those who are curious about that, I would encourage them to read the 2 chapters of the book devoted to that specific topic.
Yeah, well, I'd encourage them to read the whole book, but because even if you think that you already know this, you out there, dear reader, dear potential reader, you don't, or at least I thought I knew it. I thought I knew it pretty well. I'd read your other 2 books that dealt with dehumanization, and your one about lying, by the way, and others, but I learned a lot. And you know, I think one of the benefits of being both a philosopher and a really good historian and really sociologist as well is that you're able to pull together so much. For instance, you're not a Marxist, I'm not a Marxist, and yet the truth is old Carl had some really nifty ideas, and I hadn't quite appreciated the relevance of many of those ideas to what you're talking about. There's an observation from Marx, which you quote. It's simply that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. And in that sense, the vulnerability to what is what happens in one's society, and also the social existence of those at the top of the hierarchy who have an interest in generating certain consciousnesses.
That's right. And for the machine of our society to work, to keep on chugging along, what's necessary, and what is indeed the fact, is that we are marinated in ideologies. We're just marinated in it, and it's very hard to push back against, because it's hard to get out of. It's hard to distance oneself from, and that's definitely a Marxist insight.
I was intrigued I was intrigued throughout the book, but your chapter on ideology in that regard I found interesting, because if I had been asked prior to reading it to define ideology, I think I would have simply said it's a way of looking at the world.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't be wrong.
Yeah, I know.
The term ideology is, it's used in so many different ways. There's one paper by John Gehring, I think he identifies 24 distinct senses of the word. It's a real mess. So as with dehumanization is kind of like that too. It means lots of different things. And it's not like one is right and one is wrong, or the others, one is right and the others are wrong. It's just that it means a lot of different things. And so if we're trying to talk about these dreadfully serious topics, it's really, really, really important to be explicit about what we mean. And that's what I try to do. So I start that chapter on ideology. Well, here's one conception of ideology. I think it's very useful, very helpful for understanding dehumanization. Now let's think about it. Let's think about how it might work. And as you know, I see ideology as sort of the social equivalent of the natural selection of ideas. So ideas that proliferate, that are reproduced because they benefit one group of people at the expense of another.
So you
But
really,
it's not like what you said is wrong. It's just a different conception.
no, I understand. I think mine was a maybe a too wide-ranging perception. It's not simply a way of looking at the world. And what I gathered and really valued from particularly that chapter, is the connection between ideology and oppression. I would not have immediately, but I mean, certainly there can be oppressive ideologies, but there could be other kinds of ideologies as well. But that ideologies of the kind that you're talking about, and that is a particular concern here, when I think about it, really are in the service of oppression.
Yeah. And so, of course, connecting the dots, I argue that dehumanizing representations are ideological, that they have, in essence, evolved over time in a certain kind of social ecology because they've benefited one group of people over and above another, often by exterminating the other or enslaving them or oppressing them in other ways.
Yeah. So as a biologist by training, I was particularly appreciative. I was appreciative of many things, but in your book, but I was particularly appreciative actually of your discussion of essences and the sort of the history of essence within biology. And I'd never heard the word sortal before, S-O-R-T-A-L. It's a new one for me.
Philosophy talk, philosophy.
Well, yeah, but it's useful. I found it, if you define philosophy, and maybe I'm as wrong about philosophy as I am about ideology, but if you define philosophy as somehow an ideology, an ideology whose goal is to help us clarify our thinking, then some of these terms really do that.
I try to only use useful terms.
Yeah.
I make an effort to do that.
So I don't know if you want to describe that sortal. Maybe it's just me, biologist, but I found
very, very crudely. So, essences are really important in my framework because
absolutely crucial. Yeah,
there's a body of psychological research that addresses something called psychological essentialism. And psychological essentialism is well, the idea is that we all have a disposition, first of all, to divide the world up into what philosophers call natural kinds, like biological species. And, to organize these things in sort of boxes, which is the idea that Darwin really undermined as part of his philosophical radicalism, actually. And to attribute membership in these kinds to the possession of some deep hidden property that's causally responsible for the observable properties that are typical of the kind, So there's an inner dogginess that accounts for being quadrupedal and going woof woof and wagging one's tail. And so that's the form of thinking, and it comes very, very naturally to us. So that's causal essence. A sortal essence is just really a definition. It's a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. Like if I were to define a pen, I would be specifying its causal essence. Sorry, it's sortal essence, but causal essence is that pattern of thinking only applies to living things. It's kind of a folk biological way of thinking. And it's actually presents a formidable obstacle to understanding scientific biological thinking, because it's so easy to slip into that focus way of thinking, not appreciating the true complexity and messiness of the biosphere.
Yeah, and of species, for instance.
As species, yeah.
Clearly, that notion, and it's interesting that under the Linnaean conception, which is literally pretty old but still influential, there was the notion of the type specimen for a given taxonomic group, and that concept still exists to some extent. You go to many museums and they'll have a specimen that is the type specimen for the marmot, or for the gorilla, or for the, and anything else that's, they have this, it has the stuff of whatever.
Exactly, and that's a pattern of thinking that it's basically Aristotelian. I mean, it's ancient.
It goes back, yeah.
And one would have thought that, if this were just a matter of intellectual convictions, that Darwin would have banished typological thinking. But no, it's so rooted in our civilization that it's really hard to shake. It really requires a lot of consistent vigilance.
Well, perhaps it's evident. I can see Julie there, but I want to ask you to do maybe to just quickly, if you could, to clarify for some of the viewers how it is that essentialism and this whole phenomenon relates to your argument. It may not be immediately obvious. Yeah.
So let's go back to the game. You're all Nazis and we're a couple of old Jews, and you think of us as subhuman. Well, how does that work? Because we don't seem subhuman. I mean, look, I'm wearing glasses, we're wearing shirts, we've got books behind us.
Baldy heads.
Language, yeah, we're bald. We're bipedal. We have all the human appearance. But this essentialistic proclivity allows you to make a certain move, and that is to think, they might look human. They might have a human appearance, but on the inside, they possess a less than human essence. They are really counterfeit human beings. And that's crucial for understanding the psychology of dehumanization.
Sure.
We could go on. You two, this has been such a great conversation, but I do have a couple questions that came through. Okay. So I wanted to give our audience a chance to get some of their questions answered too. This one, David, is rather long. So I'm just going to go for it. And then if you need me to repeat, I will. Okay. So this is from Amanda. The way you needed to disassociate to detail the atrocities in the book, the way the oncologist needs to set aside the awfulness of what they work with, the way we can turn off our horror is essential to dealing with the human condition. Is this also the same mechanism that allows us to commit atrocities, or is it different in some essential way? And then it continues with, she's wondering too, what you think about the eternal debate over whether violent video games and movies either encourage violence by desensitizing or suppress through some form of letting off steam.
Okay, so with respect to the first question, some people, when they talk about dehumanization, they mean lots and lots of different things, including a kind of detachment. So there are papers, for instance, saying that there are positive forms of dehumanization, as when a surgeon treats one's body as a machine that is broken and needs to get fixed, which is a really good thing, right? We want them to be detached in that sort of way. I think that's far too inclusive. It lumps things together which shouldn't be lumped together. So in my account of dehumanization, dehumanization is specifically the attitude of conceiving of others as less than human creatures. And the sort of detachment that I describe, and the sort of detachment that the oncologist has, is something different. Now, we can go a little bit deeper into the question. You can just interpret you as asking, can detachment eventuate in the commission of atrocities? Does it help? Yes, it can. Sure, it can. Sort of. I mean, generally speaking, the commission of atrocities needs to be motivated, and detachment is antithetical, to the passionate motivation that we saw with the Nazis or with the whites in the Jim Crow South and so on. But, there is the desk genocidaire. A lot of people think of Adolf Eichmann that way. He actually wasn't. He was a very enthusiastic anti-Semite. But there are bureaucrats who, are detached, who think of victims as numbers and so on. So that certainly can play a role. Okay. The second question, it's easy to non-answer. So what you've asked me are a couple of empirical questions. And although I'm a philosopher, I don't answer things from my armchair. That requires empirical research. And so I'm agnostic about how to answer that question.
Fair enough. Okay, so Sonia, thanks for retyping this in a few times, because I know how Facebook is too, and the typos are annoying. So she's asking, it seems that dehumanization, quote, works insofar as humans understand all animals are inferior and, quote, killable. Does dehumanization occur in contexts in which animals are revered or at least considered deserving of moral consideration?
No, it depends on a hierarchical notion of nature. So my theory lends itself to a prediction. If you don't have a hierarchical conception of nature, you won't have dehumanization. So someone could go out and test that. However, the killability thing is important. Human beings, in whatever social circumstances they find themselves, have to make decisions about what sorts of beings in what circumstances can be killed. The hierarchical conception of nature, I think, is a solution to that problem. It's not the only solution, but it's a solution. So if we think of nature as arranged in a hierarchy of perfection, the lower down the scale a natural kind, a species, a form of life is, the more permissible it is to kill it or exploit it. There are many indigenous cultures, and I think this was probably, although we can't know, very widespread prior to the development of agriculture, initially maybe 10,000 years ago, that have a different kind of solution to the problem of killing, which involves ideas of the supernatural, ideas that animals, say, present themselves to be killed, and so on. That's no more and no less absurd than the hierarchy of nature, right? Our scientific understanding endorses neither of those. In fact, it's probably more difficult as a hunter to maintain the illusion that an animal wants to be hunted. I guess the answer is, yeah, it depends on how you conceive of the natural order, and in particular, the role of animals, or even plants for that matter, because killing plants is, you're killing a carrot when you eat it too. The way that they're arranged on a hierarchy.
So fascinating. Okay, this one's a little bit lighter. So this is from what does Dr. Smith read for fun to get away from his heavy subject matter?
That's a good question. I'm always desperate for time for my research, so I don't think I read anything for fun these days, but I do watch Netflix and Amazon. I am partial to movies about the Holocaust, I'm afraid.
That's your light movie watching. Oh, you talk with Sabrina about that. That's David's lovely wife, who may have some other suggestions.
Well, David Barash, do you have, I know I kind of cut you off. Was there anything else that you want to close the conversation with, or we can call it an evening if I didn't mean to cut you off with any of those other questions?
I have several pages of notes, but none. I actually did something as well which I won't do right now, but I got a copy of Goya's renowned etching, "The Sleep of Reason Brings
Oh, yeah.
Forth Monsters,"
Mhm.
and I have it on my iPad, and I was going to present it here and see if that evoked monsters. The notion, the sleep of reason, that phrase keeps resonating in my
Very,
mind.
very evocative, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So in this etching, you have this fellow presumably represents reason, and he's asleep, and all these, there's an owl and a evil looking cat and a toad, I think, and all sorts of things. And it's like, when reason sleeps, watch out, you know.
Yeah, it's not just that the monsters come, it breeds them.
It breeds them, brings forth them. Yeah,
So let's try and keep awake.
yeah, right.
Gentlemen, this was
Okay.
a fantastic conversation. David Barash, thank you for conducting the interview. David Smith, come back anytime.
Yeah, well, you be careful what you wish for.
I know. David Barash warned me of that earlier.
David, thank you so much. It's always a joy. You're the perfect interlocutor for me. And Julie, thank you so much for making this possible.
Absolutely. We're going to say goodnight to everybody. Have a great rest of your week. Thanks for joining in.